My name is Eve Zimmerman. I'm director of the Newhouse Center, in case you don't know me. Before I introduce our speaker, Erich Matthes, to you today, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. Today is the last official day of the Newhouse at Home series, which we have been running this past year. Our summer Newhouse Fellows from last year, all faculty members, generously devoted time and energy to speaking to the community in a series of talks, which range from the history of batteries to German ideas of race interrogated through the lens of colonialism. A warm debt of gratitude goes to our 2021 speakers, Jay Turner, Mary Kate McGowan, Alina Kreef, Petra Rivera, Sarah Kipper, Antonio Araiza Rivera, Natalie Valdez, Octavio Gonzalez, Veronica Fuchner, and finally to Professor Erich Matthes. My other announcement is to give my warmest personal thanks for this series to Lauren Cody, the Newhouse Program Coordinator, who has kept this series going, and I mean through various trials and tribulations, and kept the bonds of our community intact and healthy. Lauren, there you are, and you know how much work, and I know how much work you have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. I appreciate that. It's been a lot of fun.
Finally, I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing Professor Erich Matthes to you today. Professor Mathis is Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Director of the new Frost Center for the Environment at Wellesley. When he's got his scholarly hat on, he is an accomplished student of ethics and teacher of ethics, particularly when it comes to cultural heritage, to art, and to the environment. His first book, Drawing the Line, What to Do with the Work of Immoral Artists from Museums to the Movies, is available for pre-order from Oxford University Press. And you can order it on Amazon today, as I intend to do. His talk will focus on this theme today. However, Professor Mathes wears other hats as well. When he's wearing his public philosopher hat, he's written prize-winning op-eds as well as participated in roundtables. One that struck me as being especially smart is a roundtable that addresses the question, is cultural appropriation ever okay? You can find it on his college profile page. I wish we had time to discuss that issue today, but please have a look. Finally, when Professor Mathes is serving as director of the Frost Center for the Environment, he is a thought leader who generously reaches out to collaborate with others. It is due to Professor Mathes' vision that Wellesley will host the first Mellon postdoctoral fellow in environmental humanities this coming year. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Asante Shi, and having provided a small, and I mean a sliver of the funding, we have the honor of hosting her at the Newhouse Center. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Erich Matthes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eve, for that really kind introduction. Yes, I'm also very excited about Professor Shi joining us. I saw today that her fall class is full, which is like exactly what we want to see. So I'll talk a little bit about environmental issues in a tangential way today. But as Eve mentioned, I'm going to focus on my book. So here, let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? So my plan for today is to talk to you a little bit about some of the themes from my book, Drawing the Line. And I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, or aim for that, so that we have plenty of time for discussion, because I think if we've all learned anything from Zoom this year, it's that interactive is better than passive. And there's a lot of fun stuff to talk about here. So I really want to provide an opportunity for us to do that. The title for the book comes from this quote from G.K. Chesterton: "Art, like morality, consists in drawing the line somewhere," right? And if we don't draw the line somewhere, right, the worry is that we're going to be left without art or morality altogether. So part of the aim of this book is to think through with the reader where might we draw our lines in thinking about this difficult question of how we're supposed to respond to the revelations that artists whom we love have done terrible things in their personal lives. Because this is a topic that I think of as really the dinner table conversation, it's a topic that a lot of people have been thinking about, especially on the heels of the Me Too movement. I wrote this book for a general audience. I really wanted this to be a book that anybody could sort of pick up and read and get some guidance in thinking through these issues for themselves. So I'm drawing on the tools of philosophy in this book, but it doesn't presuppose any prior knowledge. It's really written for any interested reader. Quick warning, this talk will involve some mention of abuse, but nothing graphic. So I want to say a little bit about the structure of the book, and then I'll get into the content. So the first chapter of this book is about this difficult question about whether facts about the artist's life can have an influence on the aesthetic quality of their work. This chapter actually gets at the heart of where this book originally came from. So as prelude, 8 years ago, when I first came to Wellesley and taught a class on philosophy of art for the first time, I had designed a little unit in the class about the ethical criticism of art. There's a literature on this in philosophy and other fields, and the question animating this literature is, can the moral flaws of an artwork themselves be aesthetic flaws of that work? So to take a classic example is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, this really path-breaking film that has many aesthetic virtues. Is it made worse aesthetically because it's also a paean to Hitler? And that's the question that animates that literature about the ethical criticism of art. So I had this unit all prepared, and I come into class the first day, it's my first year as a professor. And so the first student hand that went up was, well, what about the artist? What if the artist is immoral in some way? Can that influence the aesthetic quality of the work? And I was like, okay, well, that's not what I'm prepared to talk about, but let's think about it. And there really wasn't any philosophical literature about this question at the time. There's been more in recent years, I think, sort of coming together as a subject of inquiry. And that's really what my book was sort of setting out to address, but not just the aesthetic question. So the first chapter is about those aesthetic questions. I'm going to talk very briefly about that today, just to make clear some assumptions that are motivating some further discussion. The second chapter is about ethical consumerism and sort of individual behavior. What should the moral lives of artists mean for how we as individuals sort of engage with their work? The third chapter is taking a broader lens and thinking about the role of institutions and also about so-called cancel culture. And the fourth chapter is about our emotions. So, a lot of us have sort of deep connections with the arts. We love particular arts works and the artists who made them. And so finding out terrible things about an artist can really lead to a sense of betrayal and emotional turmoil and conflict. So in that chapter, I focus on sort of sorting through some of those emotional issues. So today I'm going to quickly talk about something from chapter 1 and then focus mostly on some themes from chapters 2 and 3. But I'm happy to talk about anything in the Q&A. What kinds of artists are we talking about here? I just want to make clear that I'm treating art in a really broad sense here. So, well, on the one hand, we're talking about fine art and artists from history, right? So people like Caravaggio and Gauguin come up, but also contemporary arts, film, television, literature. I'm treating art very broadly here to include all of those different kinds of fields, and these characters all come up somewhere or other in the book. Okay, so first, I want to establish an idea that is motivating some of the further discussion in the book that I talk about in chapter 1. And that's the case of age ain't nothing but a number as a really useful one for thinking about this issue. So I mentioned the idea, right, this question, can the moral lives of artists influence the aesthetic success of their work, right? So you might be skeptical of that idea, right? How could something the artist does in their life, right, have any bearing on how we read the success or quality of their work? And so I just want to use this case to quickly motivate the idea that there is a potential connection there, right? So some of you may know the song Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, but pretend for a moment that you don't. And if you don't know it, then great, this will be easy for you. So as the title suggests, the song Age Ain't Nothing But a Number is a seduction, right? It's a song in which the singer, right, is trying to entice the listener, right, romantically. Now, without knowing anything else about the song or about the artist, that's not necessarily objectionable. There's lots of songs that are seductions. Moreover, if you fill in some of the details of the song in a certain way, it still doesn't seem like there's anything objectionable about it. It could even be something we think of as sort of progressive and virtuous. So like imagine that this song, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, was written and performed by Jennifer Lopez, and she's singing it to a younger romantic interest, right? In that context, the song might be interpreted or understood as a kind of progressive rebuke of double standards about age and attractiveness. Of course, this is not actually a song by Jennifer Lopez. It was a song that was performed in the 90s by the pop R&B artist Aaliyah. She performed this song as a third single from her debut album when she was 15 years old. So knowing that information about the actual song, you might already be thinking like, oh, wait a second, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this seduction in which the singer is saying that her age ain't nothing but a number performed by a 15-year-old. But it actually gets worse, if you can believe that, because the song was written for her by a man to whom she was secretly married at the time, who was 27 years old. Was already quite famous in the music world. You may have heard of him, right? His name's R. Kelly. So looking at this, right, from our current vantage point, we know R. Kelly is one of the figures who's been embroiled in all kinds of controversies about sort of immoral behavior and exploitation, sexual exploitation of young women, right? So this is just an example that I think really helps bring out the idea that filling in biographical facts about the artist can really influence how we think about the meaning of a work. The song Age Ain't Nothing But a Number can plausibly mean something different when we know that it was written by R. Kelly, right, to be performed by his child bride, right, versus, right, the hypothetical that I suggested when it was written and performed by Jennifer Lopez. So that's not to say that biographical facts about the artist always influence the meaning or success of their work. The idea is that we need to be open to the possibility. We need to be awake to facts about the life of the artist and think about ways in which they could potentially influence the work in this way. And when you think about it, it's actually a really familiar idea, right? So lots of work in art history and art criticism takes seriously the ways in which art historical facts about the artist, so for instance, the context in which they're working, the time and place in which they're working, could have an influence in how we read their work. So, it can really seem quite arbitrary from that perspective to then sort of cordon off the moral life of the artist as if it has no potential connection to the understanding of their work. So that's something I focus on in chapter 1, trying to draw out this idea that there are contexts in which the life of the artist really can be meaningful to our interpretation of their work. Okay, so moving on to questions about individual behavior. Here's a quote from Emily Nussbaum, the New Yorker TV critic. She says, "My job is actually to respond to the art itself and find a way to do that. But I definitely understand the idea that, for instance, you don't want to fill Bill Cosby's coffers. That makes total sense to me." So Nussbaum here is claiming a kind of moral permission to engage with the work of a morally problematic artist. And what I argue in chapter 2 is basically that we all have that moral permission, other things being equal. There are interesting situations that might influence the ethics of our individual engagement with the work of an immoral artist. But when it comes to our sort of private, sort of individual engagement, we really have a lot of moral leeway. So I'm going to say a little bit about drawing out that idea. This idea, right, that Nussbaum says that people don't want to line Bill Cosby's pockets. This is a really familiar idea in popular discourse about immoral artists, right? Don't feather their nests, hit them where it hurts, stick it to them, right? Implicit in these calls to action is the idea that the consequences of your consumer behavior are morally important, right? You don't want to give your hard-earned dollars to an immoral artist because of the effect that it will have, right? That idea, though, really doesn't get us very far in thinking about the ethics of individual consumerism when it comes to immoral artists. And that's so for a number of reasons, right? So first, your financial contributions make no morally significant difference to a successful artist, right? They would not be aware in any way of whether or not you have purchased their work, because your financial contribution in light of their great success is just gonna be completely irrelevant, right? It won't even create a signal. So we're gonna come back to that signaling idea, but you on your own, it seems, really can't make a difference that will be noticeable and hence morally significant in the sense of like sticking it to them or not contributing, right, to them in any significant way. Two, it doesn't really make sense for artists who are no longer alive. And you know, a lot of our moral attention in these cases does concern artists who are deceased, whether we're thinking, right, sort of historically about people like Gauguin or more recently about Michael Jackson. So this kind of consequentialist argument about sticking to them is just going to not have any bearing on a huge number of cases. And so it really limits the applicability of that as an explanation of what we ought to do in these cases. Finally, it can't explain moral worries about engagement with art that doesn't involve purchasing, right? So yeah, sure, there are financial transactions that are involved in our art consumption in some cases, but there are also, right, the sort of cherished books or DVDs, right, or other things that we just already own. And so we might still have moral worries about engagement with the work of immoral artists in these cases. And this consequentialist argument about lining the artist's pockets just can't speak to that as well. So again, it just really narrows the scope of application of this kind of consequentialist thinking about what we ought to do with our money when it comes to these artists. Now, you might think maybe the problem isn't sort of making a difference. Maybe the problem is actually something like complicity. This is an idea that comes up a lot when people are thinking about these issues. We don't want to be complicit with Bill Cosby's history of serial sexual assault by providing him with any kind of financial contribution. The thing is that complicity often also involves a failure to make a difference. So people use this term really loosely, but like a standard kind of case of complicity is if you look out the window and see your neighbor's house being burgled and you can't even bother to like pick up the phone and let somebody know about it, you're complicit, right, in the harm to your neighbor because you could have made a difference, you could have stopped, right, or somehow alerted somebody to the harm that was happening to your neighbor, but you didn't. But of course, in these cases of our individual consumer behavior, as we've noted, you don't really make a difference. So we need a broader understanding of complicity to really make this work. So these cases are actually pretty familiar, where we have cases of individual responsibility and collective action. They're familiar from environmental cases like eating factory farm meat and climate change. So the philosopher Adrian Martin has this interesting proposal in this regard. She suggests that cases like this structure are like contributing to an already flush collective fund to hire an assassin, right? So like imagine you're like see a Kickstarter and the Kickstarter is to pay somebody to kill someone else. And shockingly, the Kickstarter has already hit its goal, right? So the assassin's gonna be hired no matter what. It still seems wrong, right, to a lot of us to think that it would be, that you might make a contribution to this Kickstarter, even though by hypothesis, your contribution makes no difference because the Kickstarter's already hit its goal. And you're not the one who's gonna be doing the bad thing, right? Somebody else is gonna kill somebody. So that still seems wrong though. How do we explain that, right? Maybe looking at this cases with this structure might offer us some insight into the case of our consumption of immoral artists' work. So Martin suggests the idea of adopting a role. So in a case such as buying factory farm meat, which is the case that she's concerned with, you adopt a role as a member of a consumer group that signals demand, right? So even though you on your own couldn't create that signal, you intentionally join a group that you know has this effect of signaling demand for factory farmed meat, right? And so we might think about on that notion of complicity, there might be a moral objection, right? You're adopting a role as part of that consumer group. And in the case of immoral artists, we might think about the moral significance of that in terms of adopting a role as a fan of that artist. However, this model really only works if there's a prospect of the artist causing future harm, right? The idea of signaling demand for something, right, is predicated on the idea that the thing is going to keep happening in the future. And that certainly could be true for some artists, but again, it's going to have a really limited application, right? For artists whose misdeeds are in the past, right, or deceased, this model is really not going to help us get much further. But beyond considerations of complicity, and I say more about complicity in the book, it's a complicated story, we might also consider what fandom for such artists expresses to other people, right? So just completely aside from thinking about issues of complicity. So whether our engagement with an artist's work is public or not may be morally significant. So, particular artists, especially when their misdeeds are widely known, can become emblematic of certain kinds of transgressions, right? So you might think this is the case with Bill Cosby, or Kelly, Woody Allen. And so, we might also think about the ethics of our behavior in terms of what it might signal to other people for us to publicly endorse their work, or to organize a film screening series around it in a particular moment, right? That might also affect sort of the ethics of our engagement, right? But in these cases, it really seems to be the public action that's doing the work of explaining why there might be some moral reasons to refrain in those cases. When it comes to our individual sort of private engagement with works, it's harder to see the ways in which our works could have that expressive significance. I don't think it's impossible, right? So you might think about this in terms of close friendships, right? If you have a friend who you know is really upset about the allegations against Michael Jackson, for instance, right? You might think that it would be a kind of betrayal of your friend, right, to choose to engage, right, with Michael Jackson's work, or in a semi-public case to choose it for your wedding, right, where you know that they're going to be in attendance, right? But as we get into these issues, I think we sort of move into a space where we're thinking more about the ethics of friendship, which can be really important, right? Thinking about the ethical obligations you have to a friend could well shape what you ought to do with respect to these works, but it becomes then less about you and the artwork and the immoral artist, and more about thinking about how to be a good friend. So it gets sort of disassociated from thinking about this broader question about what is my engagement, or what's the ethics of my engagement with the work itself, right? In that case, I think the ethical reasoning wouldn't really be any different from what you owe to a friend who's a vegetarian, right? You're not going to serve them meat when they come to dine at your house. That doesn't have much to do with the ethics of meat eating in this case, but more to do with the ethics of being a good friend. Okay, so what I ultimately argue in this chapter is that being an ethical art consumer is really less about what art you engage with and more about how you engage with it. So thinking about the individual versus the public, thinking about what attitude you bring to the work, right? Do you continue to engage with the art because you just want to completely ignore the allegations against the artist? Or, like I argued in the case of Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, are you coming to the work, right, with an openness or sensitivity to thinking about the ways in which the artist's life might have an influence on the meaning of their work? I think there's a lot of artistic and ethical value in that kind of activity. And so I think there is a space for thinking about ethical engagement with these works that is positive and productive. Okay, so I'm gonna move over then to thinking about this broader question about culture and institutions, right? So not just what you individually ought to do, but maybe what we as a collective ought to do, or what powerful institutions ought to do. So regardless of what we should do as individuals, right, you might wonder, should we just make some of these artists go away, right? Have their work removed from circulation, make engagement with their work totally verboten, right, in the language of the day? Should they be canceled, right? What exactly canceling means is ambiguous. In terms of the arts, we might tentatively define cancel culture as characterized by a disposition to automatically render artists anathema because of their views or actions, right? So cancel culture is ultimately connected with erasure of the artist, often driven by social media. So for example, right, New York Times loves talking about cancel culture. I feel like they write an article about cancel culture every week. Here's one, right? Is it time Gauguin got canceled? So a question we might want to ask here is, what might canceling achieve? Now, part of the ambiguity about cancel culture is I think it tends to lump together social media activism that is aimed at canceling the artist on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what arts institutions who are in positions of power might do in the more literal sense of canceling, such as canceling an artist's exhibition. And we're going to sort of see both of those at play in this discussion. So what might canceling achieve? One, you might think about it in terms of stopping abusers, right? So people who are sort of like ongoing culprits in these kinds of situations, like for instance, Kevin Spacey, right? So Kevin Spacey was accused by many people of sort of objectionable sexual predation, right? And you might say that he was canceled in the very literal sense of like Netflix, right, removed him from the last season of House of Cards. Ridley Scott actually reshot his role in the movie All the Money in the World with the late actor Christopher Plummer. And the idea here seems to be that if you have somebody who takes advantage of their celebrity in order to prey on others, right, well then publicizing that and then sort of undercutting their celebrity by taking them out of stuff seems like a way of trying to stop them from what they're doing. Right? So that you might think of as a moral good and a justification for that kind of literal cancellation, right, of people who are engaged in predatory behavior. You might also think about it in terms of not honoring immoral artists. So a famous case in recent discussion is the case of Chuck Close, who was accused by multiple models who sat for him of inappropriate sexual harassment. And the National Gallery in Washington decided to cancel an upcoming special exhibition of his work. And so you might think that deciding to not honor immoral artists in that way allows an opportunity for institutions to take a stand in favor of certain values and say, look, we're not going to put somebody on a pedestal and act as if their art or imply that their art somehow justifies their immoral behavior. So we might want to not honor artists in that way. And I can talk more in the Q&A maybe about potential distinction between not honoring somebody, but still engaging with their work, which I think we can prize apart. Finally, you might think about it in terms of not ignoring victims, and this ties in with the honoring bit. To have, right, victims of a particular artist come forward, right, with these concerns and stories about the things that artists have done to them, and then to just not do anything seems like a way of ignoring them, acting as if their accusations aren't true or don't matter, right? Or again, don't matter in relation to the artistic success of the artist in question. And so you might think that canceling, right, certain shows, exhibitions, et cetera, is a way of communicating to victims that they are heard and taken seriously. And that can also, right, combat a culture in which victims are, continually ignored and then might not come forward to speak in the first place, right? So if you're sort of a victim of sexual assault, right, you might worry that you're not going to be listened to, right? And there's been plenty of study of this issue. And so deciding for an institution to not honor an artist who's been, right, so accused, right, is a way of communicating to victims that they actually can be heard and trying to sort of push back against the culture of sort of ignoring and silencing. Okay, so those are a number of things that you might seek to achieve through cancellation, okay? But there are also some problems for canceling. And in particular, there are problems for the sort of social media-based canceling that I mentioned before. So it seems like there are things that we might achieve as institutions in canceling, right, the exhibitions, right, or shows of particular artists, like I was just saying before, in terms of stopping abuse, right, not honoring immoral artists, not ignoring victims, right? But when it comes to sort of social media-based or crowd-based cancellation, we start to encounter some significant problems, I think. So one is ineffectiveness. So take this great quote from Osita Nwonevu. If we find ourselves moving dizzily from outrage to outrage, from week to week, we should consider that being outrageous has never cost so little or earned professional contrarians and provocateurs so much. When they're not weeping into plates of hors d'oeuvres about Twitter, they may well be writing for the Times or the Atlantic, finishing up a forthcoming bestseller, or taking up a standing invitation to join Bill Maher on national television. Such is life under cancel culture. It's mostly good. So there's a worry that sort of social media-based or internet-fueled outrage aimed at canceling successful people doesn't actually seem to often achieve its ends and might actually inadvertently promote the artists in question. So that's a worry we might have. Second, there's this worry about elite capture. And so this is the idea that powerful institutions are often in a position to take advantage of progressive causes and bend them to their aims. So this great quote from a recent article by Helen Lewis says, "Those with power inside institutions love splashy progressive gestures because they help preserve their power." Right? And so you can see cancel culture in particular with its focus on the artist as an individual as really queuing up the ability for institutions to engage in this kind of behavior. Because in a case where an institution does decide that it's going to sort of sacrifice a particular artist to a social media driven cancellation campaign, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to change anything about how the institution functions or would allow, right, that institution to continue to work with that artist and promote that artist up until this point, right? So there's a significant worry that with its focus on the individual, cancel culture, right, is primed to allow for this kind of elite capture that doesn't actually lead to any change, institutional change in the art world. I should mention, I should have said earlier, when I talk about arts institutions, I'm talking about them in a very broad sense, right? So the art world is composed of all kinds of institutions, right? Museums, galleries, magazines, art schools, right? Journals, record companies, publishing houses, right? These are all examples of arts institutions. Okay, so finally then, there's a failure, this is tied with the elite capture point, to help create institutional reform. So take, for example, a case or a kind of moral objection that I talk about at greater length in the book. So, you know, some of the cases that we focus on when we ask these questions about immoral artists are the kinds of cases I've talked about so far, where we're dealing with artists who are, you know, abusive, right, sexual predators, right, things like that. But then, of course, there are also artists who wrong primarily in word rather than deed. And I haven't spoken much about those, but I'm happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. And then there are also objections to artists that sit at this really complex territory between the content of the work and the artist's identity. So as Eve mentioned earlier, right, cases concerning cultural appropriation, right, can come up here. And in particular, a certain kind of appropriation that's sometimes called voice appropriation, where somebody sort of claims knowledge or speaks to an experience that they don't themselves share. So a really interesting recent example of this you probably read about was Janine Cummins' book, American Dirt, which is a story about Mexican immigrants coming to the United States. Janine Cummins is not part of that community. There were all kinds of criticisms of the content of the book, and part of those were informed by facts about Janine Cummins' identity as not belonging to the relevant community. So a lot of people sort of pegged this as like an instance of cancel culture, right? Because this book was getting a lot of prominent billing, you know, like Oprah was behind it, and then, right, these accusations came out, and the whole thing sort of crumbled, and people said, like cancel culture. But I think what's really interesting is if you read a lot of sort of the criticism of American Dirt, and I've spent a lot of time in this book just sort of reading online criticism. I think the most effective criticisms really were aimed not at the artist herself, right, which is what cancel culture sort of aims at, right, sort of erasure of the artist, but rather really attributed the failure in the American Dirt case to the institutions at play rather than the artist herself. So here's a great quote from Shivana Sukhdev. Said, "To me, American Dirt didn't just happen because there's not enough, say, Latinx representation in the publishing workforce. American Dirt happened because the veneer of progressivism remains valued far higher than the action of it. Without support for the marginalized already within publishing, from living wages to protection from backlash, you can't attract more. Without that growth of the workforce, you can't effectively safeguard against exploitative works. Without those safeguards, you make it even more inhospitable for diverse talent. Then you're back at square one, publishing establishment safe whiter voices because the entire chain has been neglected." So I think criticisms like this are really incisive. And although this, you know, quote wasn't in the context of criticizing cancel culture, I think it can be really rallied toward that, or marshaled toward that aim, right? That emphasis that cancel culture places on the individual artist, right, and on sort of their erasure, just diverts our attention from these really significant institutional issues that allow these events to happen in the first place. So the big emphasis of this third chapter of my book, where I'm talking about these issues, is to argue that it's really institutional reform that we want, right? We need to build institutions that will hold artists accountable in ways that will make cancel culture, right, of the social media variety, unnecessary, and will promote change in a way that cancel culture hasn't been especially adept at achieving. Okay, so just to wrap up, the question that we're often posed with in these contexts is, can we separate the art from the artist? And you can understand that in different ways, right? So you might think about it in terms of, can we enjoy the art without letting the artist's life intrude, right? Keep them separate in that regard. Can we condemn the artist and still enjoy their art? Really, this question is asking if we can treat the art and the artist as if they are independent, right? And somehow move forward in that way. And I want to say, it doesn't matter if we can, because we shouldn't, right? We really want to be thinking about the relationship between the art and the artist, and the ways in which that relationship can inform our understanding of their work, inform our understanding of the ethics of our engagement with them, inform our understanding of how we want to shape arts institutions. So this doesn't mean that the actions of the artist simply dictate how we ought to engage with their work. It means that we ought to keep both the art and the artist in view, right? And to be open to the ways that they can, and sometimes ought, to potentially influence each other. So unsurprisingly, perhaps, I think art has a really important role to play in how we grapple with the problem of immoral artists. Thanks.
Erich, thank you so much. It was wonderful and so concise, a lot to unpack. We have time for questions, and if you put up your blue hand or your human hand, we can call on you. And in particular, students in the audience, step forward, please. This is your place as well as everybody else's. So I'd love it if any of Erich's students have questions, would be great.
Yes, Liza.
Liza.
You're not a student.
I really enjoyed this talk. And so many of the examples that you give, because I teach 19th century art and imperialism, and just this morning I was teaching about Delacroix, who was had all sorts of problematic he was just kind of a gross guy generally, and I teach him exactly for that fact, because he's sort of representative of certain social and cultural habits of the time that I think are worth bringing out for the subject matter. So I guess one thing I was wondering is pedagogically, with regard, you talked about cancel culture within institutions and within sort of social media circles. I'm thinking about within the classroom itself, of saying this person shouldn't be taught, or this text shouldn't be taught, or this painting shouldn't be taught. I was just wondering, I don't have so much of I'm wondering what your advice would be as somebody who deals with this kind of material for that kind of issue that is sometimes raised within the classroom. I know I've had it with Gauguin's Noah Noah. I find that students are better at engaging with his artworks than they are his actual words for some reason. It seems to bring it closer to home. And so even if there's not issue studying the paintings, having to read his words is something that brings students have very strong feelings about that. And I also wanted to separately ask about the question of proportionality within cancel culture, because not all immoral actions are the same. And so I'm wondering what your views are on that in terms of response to that.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Liza, for those great questions. So yeah, the Gauguin is like a great, I talk quite a bit about Gauguin in this chapter, right? Because Gauguin has received a lot of focus and popular discussion, right? So one of the things I talk about in the chapter that I think is so funny is in that New York Times article that I showed the headline for, right? Like, should Gauguin be canceled? What's hysterical about that is that if you read the article, nobody they interviewed for the article is actually talking about like not, never engaging with Gauguin's work, taking it all down from the walls, right? Like, they talk with activists who've been working on this issue, but what those activists really want is what you're talking about, right? Is like to take seriously, right, the life of the artist and to talk about it in relation to their work. So I think that's really important. So I am generally not in favor of sort of neglecting to teach a work, right, or an artist just because of their personal life or their immoral behavior. That could certainly be among the reasons, right? It might sort of like add to the reasons you have, right? Maybe you were sort of like on the fence about somebody and you're just sort of like, ugh, this just sort of pushes it over the edge. I'm not going to waste my time with that person now, right? But, and this sort of gets at one of these things that I mentioned in passing, which is sort of the difference or potential difference between honoring the artist and continuing to engage with their work. I think that can be a difficult line to walk, but I do think it's possible. And how we do it is going to differ by artistic medium as well. But like one of the examples I talk about in the book is H.P. Lovecraft, right? So H.P. Lovecraft, for those who aren't familiar with him, is sort of very famous, influential Gothic horror writer who was also just virulently racist, right? And his racism actually plays a really important role in the way in which he thinks about horror, right? Like he's like horrified by people of different races, and it really comes out in famous works like the Call of Cthulhu. So for a long time, the World Fantasy Awards, if you won the World Fantasy Awards, you got like a bust of Lovecraft, right? It was like a little like Oscar for World Fantasy. So a number of years ago, right, the World Fantasy Awards discontinued using the Lovecraft bust, right, as the award because they didn't want to honor this super racist guy, right? Oh, sorry, I just love Sarah's comment, right? And that's exactly what I'm coming around to. Thank you, Sarah. You know, I think that there's a way to say like, okay, we're not going to honor Lovecraft by actually using, right, his visage as an award, right, for excellence in fantasy writing. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't read Lovecraft. And indeed, there's a lot to gain, both sort of aesthetically and morally, from engaging with figures like Lovecraft, because, for instance, right, then people pick up that legacy and engage with it in their own work, right? So Lovecraft Country on HBO is a show, right, that engages with that Lovecraft legacy. And it's not that you couldn't get anything out of that show without knowing anything about Lovecraft or not having read Lovecraft, but there's so much more to gain if you have that exposure to the work and then can see the way that new work is picking it up and criticizing it. And so I think something similar with Gauguin, right? Like Kehinde Wiley has this great series that's been described as like a riposte to Gauguin, and it's all about sort of recovering the subjectivity of Tahitian subjects, right? And so, you know, to not be exposed to, learn about, see Gauguin's work, I think in a way deprives us of the ability to really understand what's going on in this contemporary work that's grappling with it. So I think there are a lot of reasons to sort of continue to engage with the work, as long as we're taking the artist's moral life seriously. So I definitely don't think we should sweep it under the rug, right? Act as if it's not important, right? A big theme in the book is about how much there is to learn from taking the moral lives of artists really seriously. Sorry, that was a long answer, and I'm going to just talk a little bit more in response to your other question, Liza, about sort of proportionality, because I do think that's really important. So one of the criticisms of cancel culture that I think gets at something important is that it often lacks proportionality, right? So people take the same kind of response to like really, right, serious crimes like serial sexual predation as they do to the artist, right, offhandedly like saying something that was like sexist, right? And so, you know, I don't think we should treat those actions in the same way. And this is one of the reasons why sort of like internet fueled cancel culture, I think, is often not the way to go, because it fails to make those distinctions. So this is part of the reason why I think sort of building stronger institutions that have, right, like a diverse set of people who are going to be sensitive to like the broad range of issues that might be morally significant for audiences is going to play an important role in shaping the way in which those institutions handle these cases. Like when it comes to, right, sexual predators, you know, I think that we should draw like really strong lines. Like I think institutions should just not work with those people because that's what you should do in any institutional context, right? Like if you run an organization that has nothing to do with the arts and you find out that one of your employees is a sexual predator, like you should fire that person. So I think same goes for the art world. But then in some of these other cases, right, I think there's going to be more leeway for institutions to think about how they want to engage with the artist on the basis of something that they said, for instance, that doesn't need to be, refusing to work with them or firing them or something like that. So I'm going to stop so I don't talk too long, but hopefully that's somewhat helpful. You're on mute, Eve.
Okay, gotta wake up here. Jill. Jill, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Sorry. I am slow at pressing buttons. So I have two things. One, I went to a Gauguin exhibit like 3 or 4 years ago with my family, and it started a lot of really good conversations, which was important. But also, like, I wonder how many of the people walking out of that exhibit were having the same conversation we were having about cultural appropriation. And so I think that one of the kind of questions I have is like, where do you draw the line between honoring and engaging with art, especially when it's art that has to be displayed publicly in person because that's the only way to see it? Like there's a difference between me Googling Gauguin and like looking at a painting and talking about it, or having to buy a ticket to go to an exhibit to engage with it. And I also think that like that too comes in play with the classroom, right? Like if you are choosing to put something on a syllabus, are you just honoring it or are you just engaging with it? Kind of where does that come in?
Yeah, great question, Jill. So, I think that the mechanisms through which something like displaying artwork in a museum can be thought of as always honoring the artist can actually be turned on their head if you use, right, that context in order to draw attention to and encourage the visitors to think about the connection between the moral life of the artist and their work. So when you talk about sort of going to a Gauguin exhibit and, having these rich conversations about appropriation, right, or about exploitation, right, but wondering if other people are having those conversations, well, that's a really important role that curators can play, I think, is helping visitors, right, and shaping those conversations so that it's not, right, just the case that, maybe your family is having them, but other people weren't, right? So I think that's something that we can really do in these institutional contexts, right, like museums, in order to shape the conversations that people have about these figures. And I think something similar in the classroom. So, I think there are difficult cases that involve, like required courses. I don't have like a really considered view on this. I do worry about cases in which students are sort of like forced to engage with certain material. But what I often teach difficult material and morally difficult material in my classes. And the approach that I take is I just make really clear on day one that we're going to be engaging with this stuff. And for students who, for whatever reason, don't want to do that, they don't have to take the course. But I think as long as we're sort of really explicit about what we're going to be doing, what kind of work we're engaging with, there's so much to be gained by thinking critically about, right, this kind of work that we would be doing ourselves a disservice to just sort of take it off the table. And I think this is a big theme in the third chapter of my book as well, is that because cancel culture aims at erasure, I think it's really important to realize that like, erasure is not often a way of taking something seriously, right? Like, it's really important that, right, the figures that we're talking about here have done these terrible things. And we need to pay attention to it, not sort of take it off the table or ignore it. And so I really worry about the sort of drive of cancel culture to not end up providing opportunities for us to really like think seriously about these issues, right? You might even say that there's like no better way to spend some time thinking about the shitty stuff that an artist has done than by engaging with their work for a while, right? Again, engaging critically, right? But still engaging.
I think Alice is next. Alice.
Hi.
So good to see you.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I thought it was really interesting. I think you've touched on a number of my questions, but as you know, I teach Philip Johnson all the time in most of my classes for the reasons that you describe, and also for other reasons having to do with the questions that his work asks about various categories. But two things came up recently that I would be very interested in your reaction to. One was keeping the names of donors like Philip Johnson on galleries at places like MoMA. And in my seminar, we sort of wanted to put an asterisk there, and so that people would do exactly what you described, right? Engage with the issues. And as one of my students brilliantly put it, not allow him to continue to hide in the ways that he did for so long while he was alive, which I thought was fantastic. But a big issue that's come up recently in the literature on Johnson has to do with people refusing to accept his apology. You know, Johnson apologized for his fascist past and said, I mean, which, you know, he chose bad words, you know, inadequate words to describe as youthful indiscretion. But I'm inclined to take seriously an apology of that nature based on the acceptance of friends of his, for example, who were Jewish, Kirstein and Phyllis Lambert. But many, many people in the current literature, the sort of leading literature at the moment, considers that a weak response, right? That it's a form of being, to accept the apology makes you an apologist for those behaviors or those explicit pro-Nazi statements of his. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on someone like Johnson. Or it's easier to deal with the predators in my field, you know, the architectural, the sexual harassers and the predators, even though the field does not in any serious way engage with them. But Johnson is, I think, a particular case because so many people refuse to accept his apology.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks, Alice. I mean, both of those questions are great questions. I mean, when it comes to things like naming buildings and whatnot, you know, I do think that there, you know, again, it depends on the details of the case, but I think there can be good reasons for renaming because we don't want to honor individuals in ways that sometimes are sort of like legible, or like you were saying, in terms of hiding, some ways that can become illegible to people, right? Just because they don't know the relevant history. And I think there's important work to be done with respect to renaming that I think can contribute to, you know, transitional justice, for instance. I mean, I think about, right, cases involving like the renaming of roads in post-apartheid South Africa, right? Like that's like really important work, right? That communities can do, right? To grapple with a certain past and also sort of move on from it. And I think we can extend that kind of thinking to cases involving the naming of galleries and things like that. And I think that ties into what I want to say about your other question, which is that, you know, there's a lot of emphasis in, for instance, contemporary debates about, you know, defunding the police, right, and the carceral state, about, you know, transformative justice, right, and reconciliation. And I think that those are really important ideas that we would do well to sort of carry over into these contexts. I think there can be a tension when you have people who are on the one hand, right, in favor of those approaches to justice in some contexts, but then for some reason, right, when it comes to, you know, the art world, take a much more punitive approach. But I think, you know, consistency demands that we sort of treat those cases in a similar way. So if you're sort of friendly, right, towards you know, transformative justice approaches more broadly, I think that's a good model to take towards the way in which we think about artists. Now, whether, you know, a particular apology, right, should be read as genuine or not is, of course, going to be a difficult question, right? And like you said, there's a lot of sort of context that goes into that. But I think I want to say that we should at least be open to the possibility of people recognizing that they've done wrong and sort of moving forward, right, with their lives. And I mean, one thing I mentioned in the book also is that, like, you know, that's another thing that artists can do and do is sort of like grapple with bad things that they've done in their life through their art, right? So I don't think we would want to make, you know, some past transgression, right, disqualifying for engaging with the work of an artist, especially right, when they're actually sort of grappling with that transgression through their work, right? That's one of the values that art can have for us. So I'm open to apologies, granted that sometimes apologies are super empty, right? So we would want to think about it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex.
I think Susan has been had her hand up. Susan Meyer, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you. Eric, one thing I'm noticing listening to your talk is that all the examples that you're giving of moral judgment come from a moral standpoint that you presumably agree with. This artist is an abuser, this artist said something sexist, et cetera, et cetera. But a real problem in advocating responding to art based on one's moral judgment of the life of the artist is, for one thing, you're presuming that your moral standpoint is absolute and correct. And also it gives license to people whose morality is very different from yours to engage in that same kind of evaluative response to art. And I think, for example, of some cases like the following, I'm a children's writer, have a number of children's author friends who are gay, who've been invited to speak to children at schools whose visits have then been canceled by the schools because they discovered that the author was gay.
Right.
Or I think about people being accused of communism in the McCarthy era, and filmmakers, actors, writers, and so on. Or I think even of George Eliot, the great moralizer of 19th century England, who was considered a fallen woman by the standards of the time because she was living with a man she wasn't married to for her entire career as a novelist. Somehow, to the credit of the Victorian English reader, she was nonetheless a very respected and admired writer, even though her writing is often about issues like sexual morality. But the real problem, it seems to me, is that with advocating this kind of interpretation of art or response to art is, you know, the problem of determining what the artist did, which isn't always clear. Was the artist really a communist? Did the artist really abuse women, et cetera, et cetera? Or, you know, was this thing the artist said genuinely problematic? But also it assumes that your moral standpoint is correct and absolute. So it makes me uneasy.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Susan. So, you know, I think that the approach that I generally advocate is friendly to that concern, right? Because, like I've been saying, for a lot of cases, I think it's important for us to continue to engage with the work, right, while being sensitive to these potential moral objections to it, right? So one thing that you know allows for is the possibility of disagreement, right, about the moral issues at stake, right? As long as we're still engaging with the work, we have a platform for having those conversations. So, you know, in the Gauguin case, right, like if you, right, like not you, Susan, but you, anybody, right? Like, don't think that, like, you know, Gauguin sort of like did wrong by, you know, decamping to Tahiti and abandoning his wife and family and having these sexual relationships with underage girls and, you know, sort of embodying the sort of colonial male gaze and sort of the sexualization of the subject and all of these objections that people raise, right, to Gauguin, right? Well, then you're welcome to sort of object, and you should object, and you should explain why you don't think that those moral criticisms hold weight, either generally or interpretation of his work or whatever, right? And the fact that on the view that I articulate, we should still engage with the work allows for that possibility. Now, there are some cases where I've definitely argued that, you know, institutions should draw a firmer line and just say, like, you know what, we're not going to engage with this artist at all. We're not going to support their work. But I really think those are the cases of like predation and abuse. So I think those are less morally controversial. There's more sort of agreement about the wrong in question. And even if they were controversial, I would just say that those are cases in which I'm willing to bite the bullet and say, like, okay, maybe there's a risk that we have inadvertently done wrong here. But I think that in those cases, we have a much firmer standing for institutions to take the hard line, just like I said, as we would in any other kind of institutional or organizational context. But yeah, it's a great question.
But if that's the morally right position, then for an institution to take, then isn't it equally valid for an institution to say, I think homosexuality is an abomination against God, therefore I'm not going to invite this writer to speak to the children at the school. I'm going to draw a hard line there. I mean, don't you need to be consistent? If moral evaluation is crucial, and if certain hard lines need to be drawn, then isn't it also the case that somebody else's morality, which let's say is very different from yours, also gets to draw its hard line?
Yeah, well, it depends on the kind of institution, right? So some institutions will be legally prohibited from drawing those lines, right? But then for others, they, as you know, they do, right? And they might be subject to criticism, right, for doing that. But I don't think the fact that they're going to be, right, difficult cases or cases in which institutions, right, like take strong moral positions that some of us might disagree with means that we should take no moral positions at all with respect to these issues. I think that's a less palatable conclusion. So I respect that there are going to be hard cases and cases where people sort of like abuse this kind of platform and then could be, you know, rightfully criticized for doing so. But I don't think that the solution to that is to not, for institutions to not sort of take these kinds of steps.
Is Rochelle Bird still there? I know you've been waiting patiently. There you are. I recognize you from another talk.
Wow. Thank you. This has been a great talk, and I've been thinking, like, I agree with a lot of the statements you made about how cancel culture, especially through social media, isn't necessarily productive. But I'm wondering about, like, how do you think institutional progress can become a thing if not for people being vocal, and not only in the like cancel cultural bubble of the internet, but also like the activism bubble of the internet, which like intersects a lot. Like, even though I do feel that like the institutional things are very important, how is there any way to get there without that? Like,
absolutely. So, Rochelle, thank you so much for that question. That's something I talk about in the book, but didn't mention in the talk. So I think you're absolutely right. So I do not want to like disparage activism, right, or make any claims that like social media activism, right, like shouldn't be used or something like that. What I think the issue is that cancel culture, like I sort of mentioned in briefly, is really focused on the individual, on the artist. And I think that's what often leads it astray or makes it ineffective or allows for elite capture. So I think that social media-based activism that targets institutions can be really good at trying to promote the kind of institutional reform I'm talking about. So an example I bring up in the book is like the Oscars So White campaign, which I think was, you know, effective at least starting a conversation about representation and diversity in the academy, right? There's still a lot more work to do. But if you sort of like read the statements that the person who sort of started that campaign, April Rain, I think, made about it, right? Like, it's really clear that campaign is about institutional reform at the academy, right? And so I think that's great and can definitely help sort of push institutions in a promising direction. It's the sort of cancel culture focus on like, we need to erase this individual that I think can often lead things astray. Thank you for making that distinction. I think it's really important.
Thank you, Rochelle. Antonio?
Hi, thank you, Eric, for a super stimulating and interesting talk, and thanks, Eve. There's so much, and I think my question piggybacks a bit on the previous speaker. I don't see her right now, but do you address on your book a person's private affect, an affective response to works of art, because I keep going back to an author that I think, in my own case, no, is a great storyteller, but is extremely problematic. Flannery O'Connor. No, how do you engage with a private response from a philosophical standpoint, not only as part of a broader dialogue? Same with Jean Racine's tragedy Bayazet. No, I kept going back to that immensely orientalizing fantasy, and at the same time feeling torn between, okay, yeah, this is super problematic, but there's so much to it that I'm enthralled by, right? Verbally, thematically. How do you, or do you talk about how does one position oneself as a sentient subject, right? When confronted with these examples.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Antonio. So I didn't really talk about this today, but yeah, that's really the focus of that fourth chapter of the book, which is more about like the emotional conflict that fans experience, right, surrounding right the lives of artists. So I have less of, part of the reason I didn't talk about it because it's more complicated and it sort of takes more time to sort of unwind, because I don't have like a super easily it's complex, right? So like I talk about sort of different approaches that people sort of take towards that particular issue, right? So there was some really interesting stuff on the heels of like J.K. Rowling's sort of like trans exclusionary statements, where Daniel Radcliffe, who played Harry Potter in the Harry Potter movies, right, made this statement where he said like, look, what you've experienced between you and this work is sacred, right? Like nothing can touch that, right? This is like a protected sphere, you and the work, and you stand apart from this stuff that like the artist says that has been hurtful. And so I think some people are able to take that kind of approach, right? But it's like, it's cold comfort if you find yourself unable to make your relationship to the work a protected sphere, right? So like it's all well and good for Daniel Radcliffe to say like, well, nothing can touch that, right? But you might say, well, no, it is touching that, right? Like I am experiencing it, right, as intruding upon my relationship to the work. So I think that in that case, there's a lot further to sort out, right? If you feel like you can't prize these things apart. And I think there can actually be reasons to not want to prize them apart. It's sort of creating this sort of like emotional bifurcation where you sort of like take your feelings about the artist and put them over here, and your feelings about the work and keep them separate from each other, right? So if there's anything that I advocate in the book, it's for, in line with what I was saying today, thinking about the potential relationships between them in an effort to try to like provide some kind of balance, even if it's a sort of uneasy balance, right? So you might think about this, and this is sort of why I sort of come back to the work as a tool for us to use in sorting through those experiences, right? So you might think about this in terms of like catharsis, for instance, not the expunging interpretation of catharsis, right? So like you engaging with the work of an immoral artist does not generally rid you of your feelings about that artist, right? But in terms of the clarifying sense of catharsis, right? That engaging with the work might help you to actually sort out that difficult emotional tension you're experiencing. So I talk about this in the book with respect to like my sort of historical love of certain Woody Allen movies and how that makes me uncomfortable and sort of sorting through like how to feel about that. And I keep coming back to the fact that like engaging with the work is a useful tool for thinking about that emotional conflict, right? Not necessarily for everybody, but I think that it's, it's a tool that people should be open to sort of taking advantage of to sort through these difficult issues. So that's sort of like a quick answer. There's more going on there, but I think it's a really important and difficult question. In some ways, it's like the most difficult question to my mind. Thanks.
Thank you.
Erich, yeah, I know Veronica has her hand up, but I just have this question very quick about that what I notice is that all the examples that you've mentioned today are basically 20th century, very America specific examples. And, I'm constantly, as Jill can testify, we're reading works written in Japanese that have been translated into English, or maybe they haven't been translated. And I'm just wondering in the book if you engage at some point with context, because you do give, I think, on the website an example of the controversy over the kimono wearing. At the MFA put out some kimonos for visitors in the museum to try on. I think there was a painting by, it's Monet, I think, of his wife in a very fancy kimono, and that there was a big outcry here. You go to Japan and you go to the Hara Museum and you see many, many examples of Japanese male artists painting women in kimonos, white women in kimonos, the same thing, So I just, because your examples tend to be very contemporary and very Western, I'm wondering sort of how you grapple with those sort of huge shifts in context that change these questions of morality in art.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think context is really essential to evaluating, right, those kinds of like cultural appropriation cases that you're talking about. So I think the MFA case with the Kimono Wednesdays is like a really fascinating case. I teach that case a lot, and because it's so complicated, I think it's really hard to understand sort of like what position to take in cases like that. And I think that one of the lessons from the complexity there has to do with the way in which a lot of sort of popular discourse about cultural appropriation rips things out of context, right? So you have something that's designed for a particular context, and then it gets broadcasted via social media, for instance, and it's decontextualized. And that actually makes it quite difficult to follow all of the ethical contours of the case. And we see this a lot in, I think, cultural appropriation cases, not all cases, but it does happen frequently. So I do think context is really important, and I think that's one of the things that different kinds of institutions or the classroom, importantly, can provide is context for thinking about what's going on in these cases. So I do mention this in passing in the book, like just with respect to my own discipline, in philosophy, I frequently teach philosophers who had really disturbing views, both in their time and especially in sort of contemporary context. And I think that the way to approach that is to be explicit about it, right? And to talk about why they had those views, right? Why we might criticize those views, why those views might be inconsistent with their actual positions, right? Like Kant famously is super racist, but his racism is in really stark tension with his philosophical views. So I think that kind of context can be really important to thinking about how we engage with those works. It often doesn't provide really clear practical guidance about what to do, but I think it does sort of set the stage for productive conversation, which is one of the things that, of course, we want most in the classroom, in the art museum, in the kinds of institutional contexts that I'm focused on. But yeah, the Kimono Wednesday case is really complex.
Thank you. I mean, that is so helpful to me because this is coming into my classroom all the time. Sure. And I'm becoming very uneasy. And I think what you're suggesting is you deal with it head on. Yeah. Okay. I'll be calling on you next year when there are problems. All right. Veronica.
This was a really rich talk. Thank you so much. I was thinking about some of the questions that really try to bring in other criteria in relationship to morality, right? Which seems to be, morality is not the only criterion in judging artists, right? It's in connection with effective response, with context, some of these things that came up. And one other criterion would be criminality, right? Because these are not the same. Something that is immoral doesn't have to be criminal and vice versa. And I'm wondering how you dealt with that particular axis of judgment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really don't talk about criminality in the book beyond saying in the introduction that I'm not analyzing analyzing the criminal case for or against anybody, right? So like I'm definitely not engaged in investigative journalism, for instance, of any kind, or have any legal expertise. I do think that there are cases in which verdicts of criminality can make things easier, especially for institutions, right? So, you know, like in the Cosby case, right? It's like if somebody has been like, tried, right, and like convicted of something, it just sort of can more easily enable institutions to take, right, the appropriate sort of moral stand. But as you note, right, the criminal and the immoral can certainly come apart from each other, and there might be contexts in which somebody is, right, prosecuted criminally, right, for things that we don't think are morally significant at all. So I certainly wouldn't want to use the criminal system as, you know, an infallible guide to what we should do in thinking about the questions about morality and engagement with the arts that I'm focused on here. And of course, there are, you know, histories in which, right, artists in particular, right, have been targeted by criminal systems for you know, inappropriate reasons. So I don't think I have much more to say about the issue, but I do think it's an important distinction to keep in mind.
I'm so aware of the time. It's we have really made you go on for over an hour, and I'm also very grateful to everybody here who asked such fantastic questions, and to Erich for writing this book and agreeing to speak with all of us today as our we're going out with a resounding bang, I think, here with this talk. So thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, can't wait to see you all next year. Okay.
Thanks everybody, it was a pleasure.